we can definitely, I encourage you to keep on joining them based on the kind of organisms you are working with, and that would really help in honing this understanding also. And I say this again because this understanding is so key, to optimal use of your resources. Based on the risk assessment that we do, we had a presentation that I gave on biosafety containment levels. And this biosafety containment levels, unlike depend on the type of GMOs, and this new guidelines for Sri Lanka, it has, as I mentioned, it includes the uh, the containment levels, the containment levels for all types of organisms. So we have moved on, we have divided it into microorganisms, animals, plants, insects, and the what was the last one? Microorganisms, plants, animals, insects, and fish. So these are the five categories which have been included. Now, once again, the very categorization of these organisms into biosafety
Can we please have the participants mute their mics?
So the very categorization of these organisms and identification of different containment levels in itself gives a big message. As biologists, we very well know that all these in the message in terms of allaying the concerns of general public, or all those, or your bureaucratic setup who are associated with reviewing our applications and permitting us the research and other activities. There is somebody who is not muted it. Yeah.
I think someone has not muted yet.
Yeah.
I think it's the who's come there as P.
Okay.
Professor Pradeepa, can you please mute your mic? Can you please mute?
Slides.
Okay.
Are you able to see my slides?
Sorry for the disturbance.
No, not yet. Not yet.
Okay.
Yes, now we can see, but
okay. So I was just giving the in the recap, what I wanted to say was that this kind of a classification of the organisms itself is a very important and gives an important message for biosafety, making people understand that animals have to be dealt with differently as compared to plants, as compared to the infective organisms. I will explain that as we go along. And then we had a detailed presentation by Dr. Lavita Gowda on the work practices and the special considerations. And then, of course, Dr. Tyagi, he gave a detailed this thing on the mosquitoes. Of course, he gave information on the phased testing. So this is where we are. Now, if we look at the document of our guidelines, we have actually covered quite a bit. But there are still small sections, and that's why when we were devising the program, we thought we will have a day 3 on discussing on this additional information for those smaller sections, and then having some time for discussion amongst ourselves. So if I look at my guidelines, there are about 8 sections, and these 8 sections we have covered actually up to 7, and also the detailed annexure. Now, the section 8, of the guidelines, it is actually, so I have marked it 7, but actually it is 8. So it has 5 subsections, which are, very general issues: health and medical surveillance, training, handling, transfer and shipment of specimens, emergency procedures, and disposal of GMOs and related wastes. Now, as biotechnologists and as the people who are working as on research, many of you will find these issues very trivial. And they are, we say, okay, we are always as researchers worried about what are we going to get out of this. I mean, how is our, genetic transformation that we have done is performing? Are we getting the results that we wanted to get? And all those performance of the, our experiments and the results that we are getting, because we are researchers, and that's why our focus is more on maybe developing a new product or understanding some basic research and so on. But then there is the other side of the story. While all these issues are very important, and also they are important from the communication point of view and the regulatory point of view, and also it is what they will do is, even if you are working on a GMO, which is like most non-hazardous, but then these are the questions which are going to come to you. Oh, you are working with GMO, it needs biosafety. What about your health of people? And these are all some, what about, are you giving training? How do you transfer them? Is there any emergency procedure? How do you dispose of? So these are all the issues which are very favorite of the even the civil society organization, and the criticism that you might face while initiating this research. So dealing with these issues and the planning of this session was, I just wanted to communicate with the twin objectives. To first, to take these issues seriously and not just see that it occupies only a paragraph, a general paragraph in my guidelines, but also they are very important from the communication point of view. So with this background, and without taking too much time on, I've taken, I think, more time than what was allotted for the recap, I would just like to move forward and share with you this my views or some information on these 5 issues. So how we have divided this session is, the first 2 sections I will deal with. The next one will be dealt with by Dr. Lalita Gowda in detail, and then 4 and 5 I will discuss with you all. And after that, if there is anything that you want me to go back, or you want me to sort of, we want to discuss anything more, or anything we have left out, or even any general issues with respect to laboratory research, we have Dr. Lalita Gowda, who is very, not only a very esteemed researcher and familiar with these issues. I just want to add that she is also, a member of our GLP compliance in our country. She is an inspector for accreditation, the inspection, this thing, and she is helping set up so many GMO, of course, detection labs for the food safety and surveillance. So with her presence, and we also have some experience in the regulatory issues. So together and with the wisdom of all of you, we can deal with this issue and really initiate good quality research in Sri Lanka and move towards development of products. So this is the brief background, and this is how we are going to talk about. So these are all the side issues. So if we talk about health and medical surveillance, you see, health and medical surveillance, why do we do in a lab? And this is not unique to genetically modified organisms. Even otherwise, whenever we do the biological research, see, I am a microbiologist by profession, and I remember when we started working as undergraduate students, and after that in our labs, we were, there was this consideration of health and medical issues, that, those people who work with pathogenic microorganisms, how are they fit? Do they have any problem? And all those kind of things, and maintaining the containment to ensure the sterility, containment, disposal, all those issues are so important, whether it is a GM or non-GM, but with whatever level. So with the biosafety level. So the health and medical surveillance, the objective is to provide a means of preventing occupationally acquired diseases to laboratory personnel and to assess the efficacy of the protective equipment and procedures. In fact, this has become even more important in the nowadays, the corona related everything, what we are seeing. So this, what I wanted to say was when I said that this is not unique to GMOs, that the procedures for health and medical surveillance are very well developed for various kind of activities. So we have to simply follow that, and once we have done our risk assessment, we know this is our biosafety level, then accordingly apply that. So that's where the second point is. It depends on the biosafety level of research, not that you are dealing with GMOs, you have to follow everything. So case by case is something which should be inbuilt into our minds for ourselves as well as for talking to the various people. Now, who is responsible for health and medical surveillance? Generally, in all guidelines or any procedures, it is always the responsibility of the head of the institution to establish the requirements for health and medical surveillance of laboratory personnel, again, as I said, on a case by case basis. This is very, very important. What is the general activities which are taken? General activities that there should be, people should be immunized, there should be facilitation of an early detection of the laboratory acquired infections. Highly susceptible individuals are generally excluded from highly hazardous laboratory work, not the routine work. The provision of effective personal protective equipment and procedures. So this is the generally what is the basic principles followed for health and medical surveillance. I'm putting this, and I have taken all this from the very accepted documents. These are from WHO, and so understanding of these is very important to understand whether it applies to me or it does not apply to me. So when somebody comes and says that, oh, you are working with GMO and you have to follow this biosafety, why this is not applicable to me, that also is important for every researcher to know. Then the guidelines for the surveillance at biosafety level 1, the resource we have taken is the WHO. Here, now I would like to take you back to what we discussed yesterday, the risk group classification. So risk group classification RG1, and RG1 requires the containment requirements of the category biosafety level 1. So here, handling of experimental material at this level is unlikely to cause human disease or animal disease. This is what we looked at yesterday, and I'm just repeating from there. So in such a case, when we know that it is not going to cause any disease, what is the precaution which is taken? Generally, we all know, whenever we join a job, we are given a pre-employment health checkup for medical history. So that is sufficient for biosafety level 1. However, if there is anything, that of course, any illness or laboratory accidents or anything, prompt reporting is desirable, and all the staff members are made importance of maintaining general medical health. That is very, very important. So then comes your biosafety level 2. So biosafety level 2 was where the disease can be caused, but there is a treatment available. So if you are working with biosafety level 2 type of organisms, then the person's medical history should be generally recorded, and a targeted occupational health assessment is performed. So like for example, I will give you an example. In India, actually we have a form which is a part of annual report of the institutions that they submit to the regulatory authorities. And that form is very simple. It is not asking you to do, all kind of tests again and again, but generally recording that the person has remained healthy over the previous year of work when he or she was working with a particular product. The records of illness and absence should be kept by the laboratory management. Again, the women of childbearing age should be made aware about the risk. So this is on specific cases when we are working with some infective organisms at biosafety level 2. The third category which comes is the guidelines for surveillance at biosafety level 3 and 4. Now this is the most important category. Here we have to have the medical examination of laboratory personnel who work in the containment lab, and then After a satisfactory clinical assessment, the examinee may be provided with a contact card wherever, this is a very usual practice with the facilities which are 3 and 4, and they work with, such facilities. Now, this is specific to the infective organisms, but in general, all employees in research labs must be aware of signs and symptoms consistent with the diseases caused by the agents and materials present in their lab. So whosoever is working with, whichever organisms that you are working with, now of course, because of the Google, search being so easy, people are generally well aware, but there should be a little bit of a formal process to inform everyone that we are working with, like for example, when we used to work with Staphylococcus, we were told that, okay, this can cause throat infection, so you should better be careful about these things. So medical surveillance must be undertaken prior to working with biological agents as designated by the IBSCs. The most important and the safest way is to have an institutional biosafety committee and just make it a part of their job, So then it will be regularly undertaken. Certain types of work may require the use of respirator to protect against aerosol exposures. So this is all case by case. In this short 20 minutes, I am not going to give you each and every precaution that is to be taken in 3, 4 or something. I'm going to introduce you to the resources which are available, and then it is then for you and for your institutional committees or your principal investigators or the heads of the organizations to define what exactly are the requirements. You see, now there is much more awareness and all those things are there, so it's very important that everybody should be very well aware of. Like, there might be some cases where the IBSC will suggest that, maybe they should be offered vaccinations to protect them from the workplace hazards. So for example, if anybody is working with human blood or any infectious materials, then it is very important that all the workers are vaccinated with hepatitis B. So this is what is the basic, paradigms which are followed. My next slide is that, post-exposure surveillance. So in case there is an exposure or a potential exposure to anyone, it should be reported to the supervisors and the biosafety officers. We will have a separate session on the IBSCs, and where you will see that, biosafety officers are required in working with organisms 3 and 4, category biosafety containment level 3 and 4. The affected individuals should report to the clinics, and then employees must follow the incident reporting policy described in the laboratory exposure control plan or biosafety manual. So we are going to include a copy of the, kind of an incident reporting form in the guidelines for IBSC, and that form is used by everyone to report back. The principal investigator should be very vigilant, and they should provide additional information of all agents used in the laboratory and the agent modifications for treatment. But remember, most of this is more applicable to the infective microorganisms and not much for the plants and other things, So this is what is all about the health and medical surveillance. And as I said, most important thing here is the, the infective organisms when you are interacting with. So accordingly, the people who are working with other, let's say generally regarded as grass organisms or level 1 plants, level 2 plants and all that, they can simply say that, all these things are not applicable to them. And the second component that we wanted to pick up, I wanted to discuss in another 10 minutes that are available with me, is the need for training. So you see, there is an urgent need for training for all, the staff who is working, because this is the key thing. At least you must document it also. Whatever training you do, the accidents happen not because of the infectious agents, more so because of the human error and the poor laboratory practices that we have. And Because of that, even if you have a very good facility with best of the designs and best of the equipment, but if the practices are wrong, and then that can lead to any kind of a problem for the people or for the institutions that are engaged in research with the infective organisms. So that's what the first point says, that human error and poor laboratory practice can compromise the best of laboratory safeguards and equipments. How a safety conscious staff who is well informed about the recognition and control of hazards is the key element in the prevention of laboratory accidents and acquired infections. In fact, some of the, I remember when we were discussing the guidelines, there were some of you who came forward and said that we should actually give a schedule of training. Although that is not given by any agency, the reason again being the part one, that what is the type, it's all case by case. What is the level of your what is the level biosafety level of your organism? Everything will depend on that. The next point is the modes of training. This is one thing which was discussed. How do we give training? See, whenever there is a new staff or new students, generally, even otherwise, when we normally go to a lab or as a this thing, there is always a kind of a briefing given to the people that this is how you should work in the lab. So that is something which should be introduced in a more formal way. It should be, and other than that, it is always the continuous on the job training in safety measures, which is very essential. And then safety measures should be always be an integral part of a new employee introduction. New employee, new student, new scientist, whosoever is joining, it should be, an integral part of that. The training programs should be incorporated into the institutional setup. You can have 6 monthly, 1 year, or whatever, but try to incorporate them within your setup. It may be a refurbishing. We always give this example. When we travel by flight, they always tell you, this is how you should tie the belt and this is how you should do that. And nowadays, if you see, if you have recently traveled, I mean, 6 months nobody has traveled, but even before that, they will again say, even if you are a frequent flyer, please go through these guidelines, please listen to us, because when the problem comes, nobody knows. So that is why it should be made mandatory, and it should be regularly done. Employees should be introduced to the code of practice and to the local guidelines. You see, there were hardly, this is not just true to Sri Lanka but many other countries. If you We had 2003 guidelines, your guidelines in Sri Lanka, but how many people were aware of it? Very few. So there should be a kind of a safety or operational manual. You should know what is, this is the national guidance, this is our institutional guideline, and this is the code of practice. And I want to also share with you that I had the opportunity to interact with a few companies also, and the very closely, working with, looking at the way they do the research. All these things are very, very common and actually undertaken in the companies. So why we as research institutions cannot adopt it? We should not take it casually, and this should be done. And I would also like to share an experience with you here, that about 3 years back, BCIL, in association with our Indian Council of Agriculture Research, we started a program called IBO program, IBO capacity building program. So it was like the reverse side, it was not from the regulators. Indian Council of Agriculture Research is just like your National Science Foundation, which is funding these projects, but they do it in the field of agriculture. And this program was done at pilot level. So we picked up 10 institutions who were working with GM plants research. And then we circulated a questionnaire to them that, are you aware of the guidelines? What procedures do you follow? What do you do in your laboratory? What do you do in your greenhouse and all that? And what kind of training do you want? So actually, especially in case of, plants and, this one, there is hardly any, all such things being followed, because there is no culture of that. So there was, of course, the feedback was not so encouraging, and they had said that there are not that well established SOPs and all, but they were very enthusiastic in having them. And once so we identified two persons from each institutions, and then those two people, those two into 10, 20, those 20 people together sat, and what happened was when they discussed with each other, there were many of the things that they were following, but there was no record of that, and there was no proper training also happening. So we developed SOPs, and we also developed a training schedule on how the training would be undertaken up to even the labor, the work who works in the field for a field trial or even in the greenhouse or anything. And believe me, all of them were, and they did it themselves. It is not that some external consultants came and gave them. So it was all scientists like you who collectively came forward and developed. This is not rocket science, you all do much more complicated things, but this is just to be systematic. And they were so happy after that. And I am very pleased to inform you that even recently I interacted with them, and some of them are very, very diligently following that. So this really, and above all, when we did all that and we held a kind of a workshop, within that institution to tell everyone, and the head of that institution said that I'm feeling so relieved and so happy that we have such a program for biosafety, because if anybody asks me that you are working with GMOs, what training do you do, what SOPs do you follow, there was no record of all that. Although many of the things they were doing, but there was no systematic record. So it should be like, everybody, please try to have systematic training programs and institutionalize in their this thing. It would really help you comply with the guidelines and also ensure the safety to everyone, safety to the environment, safety to the human. And then, another thing which we did in that, and this is one of the suggestions which is there in most WHO and other manuals, that whenever you do the training, keep a record of that. If you have given a guidelines and asked people to, your students or employees to read, take their signatures on that. Because otherwise, if once you say, the boss says that you have to read it and then give me in writing that you have read it, signature pages, then the situation will be different. Otherwise, it would be lying somewhere and nobody will follow it. So these are the kind of measures. I mean, these are, of course, as I said, suggestive measures. You can look for more measures to ensure that everything is done systematically, research, and as per the guidelines. And another thing, when we started talking to these people, many of them thought, that as if it would be additional burden, and already so much of work, who is going to write all this, who is going to do that. But believe me, at the end of it, those 20 people who sat together, and we had one international consultant who also sat with them and developed, and what they realized was, oh, we do all these things all the time, and this is not at all an additional work, except maybe properly documenting it. That was the only difference they found. So we have, this is what I just wanted to convey, while, because going through the guidelines is one thing, but adopting, making sure that these guidelines are adopted and used by all of you is so important, So who is supposed to be responsible for training? The laboratory supervisors must play a key role in training their immediate staff in good laboratory practice. The biosafety officers can assist in training and with the development of training aids and documentation. And now remember, these biosafety officers are generally in the biosafety level 3 and 4. In other places, of course, they should be there, but they may be one of the designated scientists only. But in 3 and 4, you are supposed to have dedicated, separately employed biosafety officers. So general training of the staff should always include the safe methods for highly hazardous procedures that are encountered by all laboratory personnel. So this is something which is very general, that we must tell to everyone, whosoever is working in the lab, whether it is streaking agar plates, pipetting, making spears. This is done partly, but it would be better to have a systematic process. The commonly encountered thing: ingestion risks, risks of percutaneous exposures when using syringes and needles, bites and scratches when handling animals, handling of blood and other potentially hazardous pathological material, and then decontamination and disposal of infectious material, how it should be contaminated and disposed. We are not talking of, like, one is of course, like yesterday we discussed, hiring an agency and all, but even within your thing, the media, everything, how it is autoclaved and other things, those things also should be part of the training. Then there will be specific training to GMOs and LMOs. And as I said, I am reiterating here, it will be case by case. It will be different for microorganisms, plants or animals, and it will depend, most important, on the biosafety levels and also the stage of your activities. Some of you may be just working in the laboratories. Sometimes your material is in the greenhouse, animal house, or field trial or anything. So that training will be according to the stage of our activities. It will have to be customized and given to the staff. I will just picked up a few resources for this. This includes WHO Biosafety Manual, which is a very, very good resource, and I will just briefly introduce that to you. And then there is, for plant people, there is another very useful document. It is called A Practical Guide to Containment, Plant Biosafety in Research and Greenhouse. Then of course there are NIH guidelines which also have some of these components. And then FAO, has published a biosafety resource book of 5 different volumes. It's a very good resource. And one of the number 4 or 3 of that is the test and post-release monitoring of GMOs. And this also is a very good thing. It talks of the biosafety, how it is to be maintained during testing, particularly for plants and also for microorganisms. Animals are not included there. And then in that also, and it also highlights one good thing there is the critical points, In all our activities, we should identify the critical points. I will try to share that in my next presentation. And so, those critical points are the one which we should be taking care of, and that should be communicated to the staff while doing the training and other things. So these are the 4 quite important resources, and this is what is the Practical Guide to Containment. This was originally published in 2001 and updated in 2008. This is the one which is very specific to containment of plants and plant associated organisms containing recombinant DNA. So then, the researchers, facility managers, regulators, in 2001, they have asked, to expand this guide. So they have included containment strategies also for exotics, pathogens, insects, and also the pharmaceuticals, which are, GE plant-based manufactured pharmaceuticals, industrial compounds, and on high containment of the quarantine organisms, including those on the select agents. When this whenever there is an entry into imports of any this thing, then there might be, there is a testing by plant quarantine, and they have quarantine, there are organisms which might be under quarantine, and then a very high level of containment is required there. So this guide even provides guidance on that. A very useful document. Since we are going to share all these slides with you, I just put a screenshot of that. And if you look at the this one, it talks of, like we have done, biosafety level 1 for plants, biosafety level 2 for plants, biosafety level 3 for plants, and 4, and then strategies of containment and management practices. And management practices include everything like storage and handling, transfer of material, pest control, training and reference manuals. All this is very, very nicely given. So very important resource. And of course, then we have this WHO Biosafety Manual, out of which I just shared a few things with you. Here, this was published in 1983 by WHO. and is updated regularly. This provides practical guidance on biosafety techniques for use in laboratories at all levels, good microbiological techniques and appropriate use of biosafety equipment. I mean, this is the principle of that this is the fundamental element. It covers risk. This manual also, although it is mainly focused on microorganisms, but it has a separate section on the safe use of recombinant DNA technology and also provides guidelines for the commissioning and certification of laboratories. They have also introduced biosecurity concepts and the latest international regulations for transport of infectious substances. And there are other material which was there during the updation they have incorporated. This is what it looks like, and it has all these contents which I just discussed. So with this, I am going to close this presentation, and this was to do the additional information on section 7.1 and 7.2. We are still interacting very closely with all of you, and we will be providing a training manual also based on these presentations. So if you think there is something additional we should cover in this, then we would be happy to include that in the slide decks that we will provide as the training manual to all of you. And it is like let me say that this is all evolving processes and need-based processes, and we really need a consultative process and wisdom of all of you in further providing these resources to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vibha. Now we request Dr. Lalita Gowda to present on ensuring biosafety for handling, transfer and shipment of GMOs, LMOs, including disposal. Please, madam. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about the safe handling, transfer and shipment of GMOs and LMOs, including disposal. The transfer shipment of GMOs is basically based on the 4 risk groups that WHO has classified. And here also you will see that we deal with the same type of classifications. So the reason why there have to be rules, regulations, and standard operating procedures laid down, just like any laboratory, is that these materials which are used in making GMOs or the GMOs may carry a risk of infection to the people who are directly engaged. And you just heard Dr. Vibha tell you on the precautions and the safety rules and regulations that must be followed. Not only does the person who is handling, not only is that person susceptible to the hazard, but improper handling can also be a hazard to people around. It endangers people around, not only in the lab, those who are in the admin, the secretarial and other personnel. So it is very important that when you transfer materials between laboratories or between containment facilities, you ensure that the risk to the public and the environment is minimized or minimal. So when we talk about transport, there are 2 types of transport. Transport within the lab and within the containment, and also intercontainment between containments. And then the third type is transport of GMOs or LMOs into a country or out of a country, that is the import of GMOs. So in the internal handling procedures, you will see that whenever we do a transport, even if it is just walking out of the laboratory or taking it out of the biosafety cabinet and putting it elsewhere, we do not usually take the specimen as a specimen in a test tube or thing. It is generally taken in a container which is leak proof. And generally that, as you can see on the right hand side, is always enclosed in another secondary container. So in the laboratory, you might see people walking around with trays. The tray itself is the secondary container. Then to avoid leakage and spillage, one must be sure that both the primary container as well as the secondary container are leak proof and they do not allow the substance in the primary container to spill out. So if you're transporting cultures, liquid cultures and liquid material, then generally the secondary container, filling the empty space between the primary and the secondary container is filled with an absorbent material so that the liquid can be absorbed into the adsorbent, and when opened it doesn't fall out. The secondary container should generally be made of metal or plastic. For specimens, when they are received or when GMOs or LMOs are received in a laboratory, you should have a special place or a special reception desk for these material. So also one must take care when you're opening the package which is received by mail or air freight. They generally are opened in aseptic conditions or in the biosafety cabinet which is placed in the laboratory. So now let's come to the understanding of what does transport of a GMO mean. Transport, if you see, it means to carry or convey from one place to another. In the case of GMOs, all the movements of the GMO from a certified facility to any other location outside the certified facility. For example, it could mean the movement of the GMO from one certified facility to another certified facility. And very often, if a country has regulations for this, the person who is transporting it from one facility to another informs the regulatory agency and takes permission from them. Then the second example is movement from a certified facility to another area of a building which has not been certified by the regulator. Or it could mean movement of the GMO from a certified facility or a containment. When I mention facility, it means a containment. It could be the greenhouse. Even when you're transporting it from the certified facility to be destroyed or disposed as waste disposal to the autoclave, that is transport and one needs to take care. So all movements from a location which are specified in the license or in the permission given will come under the category of transport of a GMO. So if you look at the conditions required relating to the transport of GMOs or GM microorganisms, here we mean literally do not mean the plants over here, but we mean the plasmids and other material which are used. Just as I explained earlier, they should be sealed in a primary container. The primary container must be put into a secondary sealed unbreakable container. The secondary unbreakable container is the one which must be labeled to indicate that it contains the microorganism. On the label, not only should the number, accession number, the identification, any unique identification being, but it should also include the telephone number, name and contact details of the person to whom to be contacted in case of any damage or spillage, etc. And then documentation is very important in the case of transport, just as in any other case. If you don't document it, it is not done. So documentation is extremely important. So accounting procedures must be in place to ensure that if 10 containers are taken, 10 are delivered, and not that one is missing. Following the transport of the GMO, the primary seal container and inside the secondary unbreakable must be decontaminated by procedures which are laid down. So that is internal transport. Now let's look at transport when we talk about international transport, including the import or the export of the GMOs which come across the continents. So if you look at the Cartagena Protocol, under Article 18 of the Cartagena Protocol, that addresses the issues of handling, transport, packaging, and identification of the LMOs. There are two paragraphs which are most important there. The first paragraph relates to safe handling, transport, and packaging. And so all signatories to the protocol must follow these. And while doing this, they must take into consideration the relevant international rules and standards which have been laid down by the international bodies. Paragraph 2 actually describes or addresses the documentation that must accompany the LMO or the GMO being transported. And this may vary from country to country, depending on the intended use of the LMO. So it could be different if the LMO is intended for direct use as food or feed or for processing. It will be different for LMOs which are destined for contained use, and it will be different for LMOs which are going to be intentionally released into the environment, for example, agriculture or growing of the, say, soybean. So according to the Cartagena Article 18, it says we must follow the international guidelines which are laid down. Shipment by mail, air freight, or any other common carrier are actually agreed upon, and the requirements and documentation are laid down by the following bodies. One is the United Nations Committee of Experts on Transport of Dangerous Goods. The second is IATA. Third is the Universal Post Union. Then you have the International Civil Aviation Organization and the World Health Organization. All these two organizations together have come out with guidelines that need to be followed and implemented. So in the definition in these guidelines, just as we have risk group 1, 2, 3, and 4, here it is described as infectious or dangerous and the others. And only two categories are laid down. One is category A and the other is category B. Infectious substance in these guidelines are defined as substances which are known or are reasonably expected to contain pathogens. Pathogens could mean anything from bacteria, virus, rickettsia, or parasites or fungi, and including agents such as the prions, which can cause diseases to humans and animals. So the categories of infectious substances, according to the international guidelines for transport, are two. One is category A and the other is category B. Category A are infectious substances which is transported in a form that when exposure to it occurs is capable of causing permanent disability, life-threatening or fatal disease, in other words, healthy humans or animals. So this is almost equivalent to the risk group 4. And some of the microorganisms in risk group 3. Category B is any infectious substance which does not need to be included into category A. So we have a whole list of category A organisms. So if you don't find your organism in category A, then automatically it comes into category B. I have just listed a few of the organisms which are known, are listed in category A, that is the dangerous organisms. And and you see this includes almost all and very common to the list which was put up yesterday. So category B are the non-infectious ones. Biological products have also been defined, and these biological products are defined as products which are derived from living modified organisms, which are manufactured and distributed in accordance with the requirements of the national authorities. Biological products, the import or export may need special licensing requirement depending on the country's regulations, and also they are used for, they will require license if they have to be used for, say, prevention, treatment, etc. They are they include but are not limited to finished products and unfinished products such as vaccines. Being a member of the GAC of India, we do get a large number of applications for the import of the attenuated virus from other countries to create the vaccines or to generate the antibodies. So when this is imported into a country, the guidelines must be followed. So the guidelines also define genetically modified microorganisms, and these are classified in class 9 of the thing, where it says they are miscellaneously dangerous substances and come under class 9, which are miscellaneous dangerous substances and articles, including environmentally hazardous substances. So the genetically modified microorganisms or GMOs are not subject to the dangerous goods regulation. That means they are not subject to the regulations for category A when they are authorized for use by competent authorities. So genetically modified live animals can also be transported, but every country would have laid down a procedure for this transport, and that must be followed. So if you look at the shipment or the transport of GMOs, the questions that are first asked to decide whether it goes into category A or B are, what is the infectious potential of the gene or whatever is there? What is its potential to modify other living microorganisms? Is it A or B, or is it both, or is it none of the above? So according to these possibilities, the GMOs are actually put into the category B. The only GMOs which come into category A are where the nucleic acid substances are known to cause pathogenicity of organisms, or whether the gene codes for a toxin, example like ricin or quercetin or abrin, which are highly toxic, which have LD50 values of about 0.1 microgram. And also under category A specifically are if the subunits of any of those toxins are expressed. So only these two come under category A, and the other all come under category B. So the packaging requirements for biological materials is almost the same as what I had explained to you within the thing. One is it should have a leak-proof primary receptacle. So what is shown in here in red is the leak-proof primary receptacle. You should have a leak-proof secondary packaging. So what is shown in lilac is the secondary package. Then you can have an outer packaging of adequate strength, usually a metal container or a plastic container, which can hold the primary and secondary container with at least one surface having a minimum dimension left of about 100 millimeters by 100 millimeters. If it is dangerous goods, then the secondary package must carry the biohazard label on the secondary package. If liquids are being transported in the primary package, then the secondary package, what is shown should be an absorbent material so that it can absorb all the liquid. When multiple fragile primary receptacles are placed in a single second thing, they should be individually wrapped and separated to prevent contact between them. So most often you will find that these secondary packages, when a large number are transported, are put into styrofoam so that they fit in tightly and they do not move. Their positions are unaltered during transport. So the packaging requirements for plants and plant products are a little bit different. They should always be in an inner and outer container, both of which shall be impervious to spores and pollen. And the outer container should be sealed and fracture proof in order to prevent any unintentional leakage of the contents. So the second article, paragraph 2 of the Cartagena Protocol indicates that the labeling should be complete there. So the labeling of the container containing the genetic organism should be labeled. It should generally include the permit number or the license number for import from the country who is importing it. All details of the GM plant material, the plant species, the form of the GM plant material, whether it is a seed, whether it is whole plants, tubers, bulbs, etc. The amount of the plant material being shipped. Very important, contact details of the responsible person who is responsible for the export of this product into the importing country. And third is they have to put a standard do not eat symbol until it is cleared. For food and feed purposes, this symbol is not required. So additional requirements for shipment of the genetically engineered organisms and their thing are in case of unintentional release, spill, breakage, all attempts should be made to recover as much of the material as possible. And generally, one should have a SOP for cleanup of spills. Like in a laboratory, we have SOPs for cleaning up spills of organic solvents, of mercury, of acids, bases, etc. Here also, cleanup procedures are required, which mainly involves disinfection by using maybe the bleach solution or a higher concentration of sodium hypochlorite. The location where the spill has occurred should be marked, and you should try to ensure that there is no further release or spill of the material. And again, documentation. All corrective actions which have been taken should be documented and the regulatory authorities notified in case it is a regulated material. Storage of the GE organisms, wherever it is stored, before import or after import, they have to be very clearly labeled and stored in isolation. They should not be mixed up with the non-GE or the non-GMOs and any conventional material. The warehouse or the storage area should have effective pest control measures. So it should be just an area where no insects, no rodents, etc. can enter and damage the containers or even mix with the organism. The storage area, access to this storage area must be restricted, and permission, a list of people, authorized personnel to enter this storage area is required. And of course, when regulatory inspection officials come, permission will be given to them to enter. The storage area must be maintained at regular intervals. Maintain means taking care of pest control, insect control, cleanliness, thing. And as Vibha has explained, in case of any emergency, then SOP should be available for whom to contact, where to contact, and how to clear up that emergency. And of course, either the head of the institution has to be informed, and if it is a big consignment of material, the regulatory authorities must be informed. So coming to the storage of GM plant material, they should be stored in a way that prevents its release into the environment, especially consumption by humans, livestock, and other animals. So therefore, the documentation of how much of the GM plant material was imported and how it has been used. So you should be able to account for what is imported and what is used. The storage area should be disinfected before storing the plant material. So disinfectant, as again, can be just using sodium hypochlorite solution. The GM plant material must be separated from the non-GM. All inventory of the stored material must be prepared and regularly updated, and access to this storage area should be restricted. This includes all material, even material which is used for research. One of my experiences has been is we had imported 500 grams of Roundup Ready soybean powder for verifying and validating our GMO procedures. But we had to maintain a record and we had to account for all the 500 grams. So if we weighed 500 milligrams on a particular day, we had to document that the 500 milligrams was weighed. So these are the type of procedures which are really very important. Now coming to the transport, especially when it goes from one country to another, the air transport of infectious substances, the guidelines have been provided by IATA, and the guidelines are very explicit, and they tell you exactly what has to be done. So here the packaging material and principles have been delineated for category A and category B, and it clearly indicates for category B, we need to follow the packaging instruction 650. That is the diagnostic specimens. You should have the label. You have to use the UN 3373 label, and we do not use the biohazard label. In case of category A, where it is the infectious substance, we need to follow the packaging instructions of 602, and we need to put this. It is mandatory to use the biohazard label. So here is the example of a category 602 package, which is used for the category A. So you can see that all the primary receptacle, you have a secondary receptacle, you have absorbent material, you have a leak-proof cap. The label of the secondary container must contain the information. You have a big outer package, then you have the label UN 2814, the biohazard label, of course, from, to, and the label for keeping it upright. Now for the category B, the substances, the packaging rules and regulations are also very clearly laid down, and this gives you an idea of the packaging. So here is what I was explaining. When you're trying to transport a large number or different thing, you have to put them into containers so that they are held upright and they do not, during transport, no breakage or spillage will occur. And we don't use the biohazard label, but you use the label UN 338. When these labels are put onto the packages, the people know how these packages have to be transported. Now, category B infectious thing can be, if you do not have a 650 package, you can put it into a 602 package. That is the category A package. But you cannot put a category A infectious substance into the category B package, that is the 650. It is against the international conventions. So now coming to the disposal of GMOs, all GMOs and waste potentially contaminated, as I explained to you yesterday, must be disinfected by using a laboratory autoclave, and they also should be disinfected before they are transported out. So even if you have a person who comes to collect your waste disposal, you must disinfect it before it is handed over to the third party, and not expects the third party to do the decontamination. So they have to be transported in your guidelines for the transport of GMOs. Gloves must be worn while transferring the primary containers. If any spill has occurred during storage, you have to take care, as I said, by decontamination, and the spill material and the area must be decontaminated. In case of the GMO plants sorting in greenhouses, you should have a standard operating procedure for the decontamination and the incineration of these plants, or any other method that you document, and it must be approved by your institutional biosafety committee and the regulatory authority if it is GMO. Thank you. So in a nutshell, I have tried to put together and tell you about the procedures required for decontamination.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lalita. So we request again Dr. Vibha to present on emergency procedures and reporting requirements. Please, madam.
Presentation on the packaging, handling, packaging, and transfer. Just give us a moment. We are about to start.
Okay, okay.
So the slides are visible.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
We can see.
Okay. So as I indicated in my first presentation, that there are 5 components, of the guidelines, and in the section 8, and the last 2 are this emergency procedures and reporting requirements. Actually, it is emergency procedures and disposal, but disposal has already been dealt with by Madam. But I wanted to also talk a little bit about, the reporting requirements. So I have added this in the in this one, because whatever we do, it's very important to record, as I have been stressing even in my first presentation. So a little bit about the reporting requirements also we will discuss. It is like, why do you need an emergency plan? So anything which is regulated, and anything which is hazardous, even to whatever extent, there is a need for emergency plan. And in India, actually they ask for an emergency plan for everything. It's a part of the application forms. It is part of the, IBSC reports. So sometimes if it is not, if you think that, emergency, there is nothing specific for a particular GMO, LMO, even that we are supposed to report. If there is nothing, but why it is not there, why it is not, applicable to me. I have all the general laboratory emergency requirements like all those fire, this, that hazards already, but then there is nothing that I need to do additional for my the GMOs or LMOs that I am working for. But otherwise, the for biosafety level 3 and above, these are very important and actually should be prepared in the labs and in the institutions, with the due information to the authorities. Now, who prepares this plan? The fellow who's working, the principal investigator or the lab supervisor. These are the people who have to prepare the emergency plans. And the plan should include measures not just for the individual lab, but for the institution. So that's what we should indicate, that this is the requirements, these are the emergency situation for the, for my lab, what happens in the lab, and then any impact on the institution. So this is reference to the section 8.4 of the guidelines for the safe use of GMOs, LMOs in laboratory in Sri Lanka. What are the key considerations for preparation of an emergency plan? It should be once again, I am coming back to what I said initially. It has to be based on, the assessment of the risk group and the biosafety level. That is the criteria for all your planning of the work. So the first thing that I have to do is the risk assessment based on the risk grouping specific to Sri Lanka. Here again, please recall the discussions that we had when we were formulating the guidelines. And even in my presentation day before yesterday, I said the risk group classification is broadly given by WHO, but then depending on the situations in that particular country, it is always case by case. So you have to consult the risk group classification in the in the annexure of our guidance document. So then it has to be prepared along with submitting an application for notification or approval of research involving GMOs, LMOs to regulatory authorities. So whenever we start, these emergency considerations are considered right at the beginning when we make our plan. Say, okay, what could be the emergencies, where it could be leak, where it could be spillage, all those requirements which Madam mentioned today and yesterday in her detailed presentation on these are the operational. We have to identify the loopholes and then prepare an emergency plan according to them. आज का program then it may be the emergency plan should be reviewed by the institutional committee and it should be recorded. It should be recorded, and in our case, as I told you, it is always submitted to the next level of the committee, which is the review committee on genetic manipulation. Then it may be reviewed based on the experience of using GMOs in a particular lab or institution. This is definitely something very common because as we go along, we learn about this experience and then we can modify certain things. So it is not like a static thing; it can be dynamic, and as we go along, and also your use of GMOs will also move on. No, suppose you have started working a plant or a vaccine or diagnostics. So initially you will be doing very small level of work using very small quantities. Then you would be moving on to next step or its testing or large scale manufacture or scaling up. So there will be a lot of activities. So then based on the level of the activity, level of the this thing and experience, this can be a dynamic document and can be continue to be modified. So then, what are the key considerations that we should keep in mind when we make our emergency plan? As I mentioned, it has to be, am I repeating this? Or? Sorry. It has to be prepared prior to starting any GMO activities to effectively deal with any possible accident and limit the hazard to the human health and environment to the maximum extent possible. So we have added here environment specifically because we are also in plants, it is more related to the environmental issues. A responsibility of the PI and head of the organization to ensure that emergency plans are prepared in advance. Here also it is very important to understand that it is not always the infective organism for which we need a plan. It is also keeping in view the environmental considerations. You see, if you look at any weed, like in India, we have a very uh, big problem of Parthenium, which is a weed which is also called Congress grass. And this weed is not any human hazard, but it is so much hazardous to the environment. It occupies large areas and affects, the cultivation of the proper this thing. So that's why everything is important. Sorry. So it is the responsibility of the principal investigator and head of the organization to ensure that emergency plans are prepared in advance. Yesterday we had so much of very good presentation, although there were certain components which were probably related to the trials on mosquitoes. If you take mosquito as the case study, then we would need an emergency plan so urgently, because even if it is a contained facility and you are working on that, how we are going to limit the escape, how you are limit the possible any so the hazards would vary, the containment procedures will vary, and so would vary the emergency plan. This would be very case specific. It could be as small as half a page, or it could run into little more details. So like I said, will vary upon the type of organisms, with microorganisms, plants, animals, insects, etc. Every organism has their own biology, their own behavior, and accordingly the risk group classification, and that's why it is not that it is not one case fitting all. A written plan is a very much a necessity, particularly when you are dealing with 3 and 4. In fact, I will come to the next one, that this kind of plans should actually be pasted somewhere in the lab so that people know that what they have to do in case of any problem. So, and also we have to look at, this is not just for a regulatory compliance, but this is for the safety of all us, the colleagues who are working, the people who are working there also. So, this is what we have taken from our, guidelines, where we just mentioned that the general components which are there include this: breakage, spillage, accidental injection of this one, aerosol release, breakage of tubes, fire, flood, etc. So these of course should be always there for any lab, but and each lab will follow appropriate procedures depending on the specific things that they are doing for hazardous thing. I'm saying these things because when you look at the documents that I'm referring to, they will mostly refer to this, and then they will come to the specific considerations. So we have to have part A, and part B is something which is specific to GMOs and LMOs. Procedures to control the GMO in case of unexpected spread, measures to decontaminate or eliminate the effects in case of an accident, and methods for disposal or sanitation of plants, animals, soils that were exposed during the accident or spread. These would be our main components specific to GMOs and LMOs. I just picked up this example, which is, I have taken this again from WHO because this is what is the main document for microorganisms particularly. And they have said when you are preparing an emergency plan for the infective organisms, then you should take care of identification of high risk organisms should be first identified. Then high risk areas where you can face the problem: laboratory, storage, animal facility, at-risk personnel. Who are the people who are likely to be, affected or can be affected? List of treatment, identification of responsible persons and their duties, biosafety officer, safety personnel, local health authority, clinician, whatever. So you see, remember we are talking of high risk, 3, 4. So in terms of documentation, I am telling you everything. But remember, if you are working with a transgenic potato, having a gene from maize, naturally all these things will not be applicable. But it is our duty to inform you because the guidelines are are for all types of organisms. That's why we are putting so much emphasis on this. List of treatment and isolation facilities that can receive exposed or infected persons, transport, lists of sources of immune serum, vaccines, drugs, provision of the emergency equipment. All this has to be present there. You know, when we had these training programs for our ICAR institutions, Indian Council of Agriculture Research, that I mentioned in my previous presentation, for 10 institutions and 2 officers from each were trained, and they were all, they were all then they subsequently they did the trainings, they created the SOPs within their institutions, and they did the training of all their officers and all. And you know, when we interacted with them after all these systems were put in place, there was initially a lot of resistance, even for the low risk organisms. You know, things like many things we think as if they are waste of time and energy, money also. Oh, why do you need this, like that? But then when they are educated about it and they started practicing it, they were also as satisfied, and we were really informed by them, that it gives so much sense of confidence and this much and legitimacy to all the research that you do, even to, to the outside world, that such work is undergoing here. This is very briefly, I just mentioned that there might be considerations. I was talking about the risk, the the risk assessment part. So in case of plants, there will be 2 important considerations. We also have to understand the biology of the plant, or even this will be applicable even for animals, how they behave, their behavior. So in plants, for example, it is the pollination behavior. So even if I have a greenhouse or anything, my emergency plan will include how much distance does this pollen can go. So I will say that I will try to ensure, if I have prepared an emergency plan, let us say working with, transgenic mustard or anything, then it says that the isolation distance, even in case of escape, the isolation distance maximum it can go is 50 meters. So if I have studied this and I have included it in my emergency plan, then just imagine it is so easy to follow that next to my greenhouse, another 50 meters I don't have to grow mustard. That is the only thing I need, There's nothing more than that. So while it would look that it is like a very, complicated thing, but when you actually set out to do, these are very simple things and they can really help you, streamline and systematic processes in place. Similarly, dormancy was another point. I just wrote these 2 because they came to my mind. So I thought I will just put in and share with you, that this is what the whole thing is about. So emergency plan for large scale operations. Whenever there are large scale operations, then particularly you should always have emergency response plan. And this is actually a mandatory requirement here. Even in India, when you are doing fermenters or we are trying to do anything large scale operations, then emergency plan has to be there as part of the application itself, And then, as I said, the emergency plans is not a static document. It should be reviewed periodically based on new information from internal findings and or external developments, regulatory, local, international best practices. One of the important things which is part of the emergency plan is also whom to contact. Emergency services, who should be my contact point if something happens? The institution or the laboratory itself, within that, who are the people First of all, I have to contact that director of the institution, laboratory supervisor, biosafety officer, responsible technicians, who is to be contacted when. Even that should be a little bit of, documented for smooth activity in the lab. As I had already mentioned to you that there are additional resources available. All these resources which I mentioned in my previous slide, they have a section on emergency plan, and they will give the guidance on how you should deal with this when you are going to work with GMOs and LMOs. Now, in addition to that, I am going to very quickly talk about with this we finished our guidelines, but then I had specifically put this reporting requirements because, as I said, I always feel, I have interacted with several institutions in my country, and we always feel that there is always a gap in reporting requirements which needs to be strengthened. So what we should do, and now that you will be doing with GMOs and LMOs, and if you have your this guideline adopted and in place, then you are also supposed to keep a record of compliance. So it is very important that in your laboratory you identify a focal point who ensures that this particular guidelines they are complied with, and good lab practices, biological containment, etc. Everything is in place. So he is the fellow who will be checking that training is being held regularly, this particular thing is there or not, SOPs are there or not, and all that. And to facilitate this focal point, to comply, it is always very good to develop what we call standard operating procedures, and this should cover the life cycle of the GMO. Develop and implement training for them. And SOPs also include, always there is an SOP to ensure that accidental escape of the regulated plants or whatever microorganism, it doesn't take place. Periodic laboratory inspections by, again, an authorized person every 3 months reviewing it is very, very useful. Don't make elaborate forms, yes, no type of things, and that will help. Then, we have to, this focal point will assist investigator in developing emergency plans and also investigate and review that. So you as the principal investigator, your responsibility will be shared. And they will also contribute to the preparation of the annual reports as and when requested. And then it's very important that, even if we develop the SOPs, I have taken these slides, just to share with you from our experience with IBOs, which was an actual experience, where we interacted with people and they had, they actually implemented all this and very happily did so. Across your institution, every lab in activity implements the SOPs. That should be the goal. The principal investigator, once it demonstrates its commitment to compliance, the staff will automatically integrate SOPs into everyday behavior because their actions are going to be the basis of risk management. You have identified your risk, but now all this story is all about managing those risks prior to your approvals. So risk management will work when all the permit conditions are met correctly, all the controls are in place, and then the biosafety of the GE plant research would rely on proper internal auditing and reporting procedures. So this is so much important. And then, like this is just an example because I just picked up these slides from my experience with plants. So containment of plants in the lab, what is the goal? This is what we have to communicate to them. Prevent the accidental loss of material, co-mingling, corrective actions. So anybody who is permitted and also the facility in charge, they have to ensure this. So containment in the lab is related to storage, movement, manipulation, restriction. Very simple. This is how those IBOs, they did it for themselves. Now you see, another thing which came out, out of our experience with them, it is not that it is only the biosafety compliance, but it also helps you maintain your product integrity. You see, if your storage facility is not properly stored, something which you have worked for years can just go here and there, and you will be losing out on all your years of research material. That is so important for you. Or if it gets mixed up, then also you lose on your trades. After all, there will be publications and patents out of it. So biosafety indirectly also helps you in maintaining your product integrity. Secure storage facility, clean and orderly storage facility, properly labeled material. Look at this picture, there are all boxes by different students or whosoever, and many of them, if you see, are not labeled. So whose is what? Oh, mine was an orange box. You have also brought it in orange box. My God, the whole thing gone. One was G, another was non-G, everything mixed up, and my, very good strain also gone. So there is so much of importance of all these things, and these storage facilities should be regularly monitored. And these are just some of the slides which I'm not going to take too much time on it, but these should be locked, they should be inspected. These are the kind of SOPs they prepared. An up-to-date facility inspection record should be there. Inventory should record the current contents of the storage and who added and who removed. There should be a label, above this GE plant and like that, and then automatically the biosafety is maintained. When something is labeled, somebody will look at, oh, this is this thing, so I should not disturb this. Another thing, movement, I don't need to mention, madam has already given detail. So movement is outside the institution and within the institutions. So within the institutions, you should have secure containers, primary and secondary, not somebody spilling the material here and there. And that is more important when you are dealing with GMOs. It is regulated. If somebody has spilled and it has goes out and it has grown somewhere, years later you may be, questioned. We recently had a case in India where there was this bitty brinjal found grown illegally somewhere, in some farm. So there was a complaint, and bitty brinjal is not yet approved, and they picked up bitty brinjal and they sent it to a detection lab. So now the initial suspicion was that this is this bitty brinjal is the same which was developed in India, not approved, but extensively grown in Bangladesh. So it has come from Bangladesh. But when they did the testing, it was not that event. So what was that then? So then, it is going back. 3 or 4 types of trials have been permitted. Which all institutions did this trial? What was their vector? What was their details? So all those details were taken out, and to check which of them could have, and how would something under research would go out because of this kind of spills and not proper maintaining the SOPs. So properly labeled material, clean containers, all this is so important. Secure containers, control material while in use, like that. So even the destruction, madam already mentioned about disposal. We have to, monitor the effectiveness of the destruction also. Finally, there is, if these guidelines, when these guidelines are adopted, and you all will be having institutional biosafety committees, there is going to be a requirement to furnish an annual report. So using all this, the National Competent Authority is only worried about the observance of the safety guidelines. So most of these things, once are there in place, you will be able to very easily fill this report. And the last slide, if there is any incident with the organization such as non-compliance or significant research related or overt exposure, then you should be informing your head of the institution or IBSC chairperson, who in turn would report to the National Competent Authority. Thank you very much. I am sorry for have taken another 10 minutes, but I thought this should be discussed, and because this will help you in implementation of the guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahuja. Actually, even though if you take the minutes, it's really very valuable information and useful information you have presented. Participants, is there any question? Because it's really, the presentations are Dr. Lalita's one and Dr. Ahuja's one also, it's really it contains very valuable information. So I don't know whether definitely it will be useful for you all. Participants, do you have any questions? or comments? Anyone? Nobody has comments or any questions?
The participants can unmute their mics
Yeah.
and ask questions. Yeah.
Actually, Dr. Ahuja, like I am Chamari here. So actually, I had the question like then actually you have mentioned that. So when we make this SOP in this IBSC, like then are we independent like then as that in if we take this two different universities, so we can prepare our own SOP, or then is there a kind of a guidelines? You mentioned some points like so to make it like little bit elaborate if you can, like whether we can have our own SOP or?
Yeah, no, you know what? As I said, the SOPs would also depend on the organisms that we are working with. No, so they have to be case by case. Different universities, different laboratories make their own SOPs for contained use. Particularly up to the contained use that we are talking today, there is going to be a lot of variability in the way the research is done. Somebody will work with other microorganisms, plants, animals, and like that. So most of the institutions or organizations have their own SOPs they make, you know. But when it comes to the confined field trial, then there are so many times like, you know, confined field trials of GE plants. In India, we have the national guidance on that. But the contained use, nobody gives. The government will give you guidelines and then you can develop your own SOPs. You need not copy anyone. They can be made by individuals and even from lab to lab, you know. There is an institutional, this thing, suppose you belong to University of Colombo. So University of Colombo has maybe, you know, so many departments who work differently. Institute of Molecular Biology working on something else, you working on something else. So you can have your SOPs for your own this. Although as a collective effort, like, you know, the experience that I shared with you of the 10 different institutions coming together, because they were all under Indian Council of Agriculture Research, so they worked together and prepared a kind of a SOPs for laboratories for ICR. So ICR institutions will follow that. So they prepared SOPs for a lab and also for a greenhouse. So for both of them, since they were like, you know, I told you 10 institutions came together. So now they are applicable to all the ICR institutions. They have been adopted by them. So that's how you can make an effort. But there is no, it is not necessary that every institution, you know, should, every institution is independent of making the SOPs.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. No, actually my question is then what is the control like, so who will overlook that, like so
the
whether
head of the organization.
Head of the organization.
SOPs is your own, you know, effort to comply with the regulations.
Yeah.
So that's what I am saying, you know. And Professor Chamari, let me tell you, I was so pleasantly surprised, you know, with the response of the everyone in that institution who were working. You know, they said now we have something to follow, and it is not at all an extra burden.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. Thank you.
Anybody else? Anyone can.
So I like other question like same. No, then these things we need to clear, like get it clear. I mean, so then in case that head of the institution is not having expertise in the field of that what we are working,
Yeah, molecular biology or biotechnology.
Yeah. So then,
So, yeah. So in that case, normally, see, after all, the regulator, like the Ministry of Environment or whatever, they would fix the accountability on the head. But of course, in most cases, what we have seen, in reality, the head of the biotech division, they would be the ones who would be this thing.
okay.
Mostly, like in the universities, particularly, like you said, the vice chancellor may be from physics field, so he may not know, and he may not
Yes.
be interested in all this. But then the principal investigators can always interact within their, like your biotechnology department, that is, all of you can come together and have a kind of SOPs for working with the genetically modified organisms or even otherwise, microorganisms with a section on maybe GMMs.
Okay.
But there are like some institutions, where like your own institution, ICGB, where you studied. So those are the ones which are dedicated to biotechnology. So there the heads will be more aware of the requirements for all this.
So it seems other participants, they don't have questions.
And if you're looking for templates, where to begin,
Yeah.
then, actually, if you go to the big universities, like in the US or other places, they would put everything, their institutional biosafety committee, what it does, what are its responsibilities, and in some cases, they might give them additional responsibility of, not just the GM, but otherwise, some other guideline also. All that would be documented, and in fact, they don't even have the, the formal forms for the. In US, it is like on paper it is voluntary, but then the best of the things, you see the best of the forms and best of the SOPs, you can actually find there.
Okay.
Proactively people do that because in those cases liability issues are there, if something goes wrong there are strong liability issues.
Yes.
Whereas in our countries, liability issues are not that strong, and that's why we are lagging behind.
Yes.
Anybody else? Dr. Kamanthi? Dr. Kamanthi, do you have any questions?
No, actually, I have to study more on that, and I think still I am having problem for the waste disposal. Even our general molecule laboratories don't have such strong procedures. Actually, I think we have to discuss this one. How to disposal procedure properly. Because as I know, most of the laboratories, even the liquid we just dispose, we are trying to do our level best to do treatments and all those things. But how I think we have to see on that matter. Actually.
Yeah, proper disposal procedures should be developed.
Yeah, definitely we have to.
I can give you a suggestion. You can actually contact the big hospitals, because the hospital will definitely have somebody for biomedical waste. Because for us also, it is the person who was collecting biomedical waste from our health center. He started collecting this biomedical waste after we contacted him. So, the health will definitely have biomedical waste disposal. The same person can take your molecular biology waste.
Yeah.
That is, yeah.
Actually, it is very good that you are raising this, because once we start talking, then only the solutions will come. So, first of all, it is very important that we have the guidelines in place, and then people start implementing them. These may not be foolproof. Maybe they need a review a year later or 2 year later, and the people are quite knowledgeable to take care of that. But I think first effort should be by the FAO to ensure that these are adopted, and then maybe with the help of NSF also, NSF and FAO together, later NSF, that this is implemented, because that will give experience and confidence to everyone.
Yeah, once they started to practice it and implemented only then they can get used to that guidelines and they can slowly develop the other procedures also.
Actually, I wanted, initially that one of those IBOs presented here their experience. But, since we are now offline, we are doing. That's why, it was like sort of little, didn't have the time to make all these things. But suppose we have another kind of a combined something in person or somewhere, then I will try to get one of those IBOs and actually share how they implement all this.
Okay. The other participants, Dr. Shamila?
Yeah, I'm from the Kadama Medical Faculty. So I was thinking, like, we need to get this going at university level. We don't have any biosafety committee. How are we going to move with this? At the moment, I feel like I'm just an individual and there are these individuals, but I think we need to, within our institute, maybe get together, have some meetings to move this, right? From it's now.
Yeah. I think for Dr. Shamila's question, I think it is Ministry of Environment also should be involved in this, because once the guidelines are accepted, it should be circulated among the institutes and research institutes as well as universities, and we have to have instructions to follow that. So in that case, the institutional biosafety committees should be formed by each institute. Is that so, Dr. Ahuja?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. If there's an official kind of that's why I said,
Yeah.
the key to the whole thing is that it should be accepted, and it should be, information provided to all, and then only you will be able to, sort of, and then there can be ways and means to, train people or train this one, develop these SOPs and other things.
Yeah, I think so. This is the kind of a effort to make the people that who are involved in the research, to make them aware.
Yes.
So I think so. Once the guidelines approved, so as universities, so we can form these IBSCs. So together, so then we can work together.
Actually, I had a discussion with the Ministry of Environment, because we are doing some projects on bioremediation and some other projects about this lab biodegradability. So actually what they came up also, that there are no particular regulations set up by the country, and especially in our institutes. So actually it would be good that if we can get together and set up it from the initial stage, right? From the scratch, we have to set up it by identifying what are the biological materials coming up and what are the chemicals generating from our labs. So I think we have to do it together with the environmental ministry. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Dilrukshi, even for this biosafety project, they are the focal point. So once, as Dr. Ahuja said, once the guidelines are approved, actually they have the authority to instruct the institutes to follow these biosafety guidelines.
Okay.
As such, then once the institutes are informed, then of course, like ethical review committee, you all can set up the institutional biosafety committee. And as far as considering NSF, we can ask if somebody apply for a grant related to GM project, then of course we can ask the approval from the IBSC committee.
Yes, yes.
So definitely you all have to set up the committee now.
Okay.
So I will just intervene for a minute here, See,
Yeah.
this is the kind of issues which come up, Now, Dilrushki has done very good piece of research. Now she wants to take it out and, maybe scale up or do that. But who is going to be responsible for these things? Even after she takes enough measures, I mean, the risk can be negligible, but there can be something which can happen. So scientists alone cannot do everything. It has to be a collective responsibility. So if there is an institutional biosafety committee, the head of the organization is there. So it gives you a way out, that okay, we are taking care of these SOPs. This is what we are doing, and now we want to do this large scale. We are following the Ministry of Environment guidelines. So nobody can be harassed, tomorrow if there is unrelated thing and people start blaming the scientific community or that particular lab or this, then you will have all the documentation in place, all the approvals in place for your product and whatever you have done. So this is where it helps. Many times it is not that it may be a totally harmless product, but there is an unnecessary, this thing. I'll give you, like we discussed, potato with a gene from, very, very safe, this thing. So, but if your institutional biosafety committee is there, it would have recorded that this belongs to the biosafety level 1 because of this reason. No requirements of any special consideration. So once all that is recorded, you have a record to show that look, my project is not responsible, it can never be, and it is not me who is saying. There was this committee of scientists with the participation of the head of the institution, which all agreed to this particular thing. So this really helps you. Actually, this is not a hurdle, but it really helps you move as you move ahead in the life cycle of your GMO or any organism for that matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahuja. Anybody else?
So, Chats, if you have any doubts or anything, you can ask from them to clear the.
Yes. So I have a suggestion that, as you know, we are going to put together a training manual based on all these presentations we had. So if there's anything you feel was out of place or not required or something which should be added, it would be really nice to have your feedback. And then with the guidance and from Dr. Lalita Gowda, we are going to together put this manual for you. And the manual will basically be slides and details of the resources and a brief note on, corresponding to the guidelines. This is all going to be there. But if there's something you feel more detail it was like not so much required, or there should be some section which should be elaborated little more, please feel free to contact. And let me know within let's say a week or so through NSF, of course. You can get back to Shalini or Dr. Gauri, and then we would take into consideration that.
We also will circulate the suggestion. We will circulate among the participants. If they have any comments or anything, we can inform you. Dr. Sugandhika. Yeah, Dr. Ahuja, Dr. Sugandhika has there's a comment from Dr. Sugandhika. Because actually the internet connection is something problem, it seems. Their faculty has a mechanism in place for the waste disposal. Just a comment.
Yeah, right. So whatever organisms she is working with, so you can have a review of the, like, identify the risk level and then just check whether that mechanism is sufficient or if there is anything else which needs to be done.
Yeah.
And that will ensure that you are complying with the official guidelines.
Shall we wind up, or because since there is no Shanaka?
Shanaka is mute.
Chanaka?
Not there.
Chanaka?
Anaka.
Okay.
Yes, again.
Yeah, hello.
We can conclude.
Yeah, sorry, I was having signal issues, and the last bit, it was just a little shaky. But any other questions from the participants?
No. So, in the absence of any questions, okay, we can conclude the session. Actually, I really, on behalf of NSF, I would really thank Dr. Ahuja and her team, Dr. Lalita and Dr. Tyagi, who is not here today, but Dr. Ahuja and her team, all of them for their commitment and the support given. And I hope the participants would have enjoyed the online session. Maybe, I don't know, but actually I was thinking that because the presentations are very valuable and it has a lot of information. So unfortunately we couldn't have the physical training program. If we can have that, it would be really very much informative. But even though if you all are really get into this, and if you all can interact and discuss it, it would be more productive. So I would like to thank Dr. Ahuja, Dr. Lalita and Dr. Tyagi, and also FAO, Ministry of Environment, for joining in this training workshop. And the participants who are really committed for these 3 days, and they also joined the training program. And the national consultant, Dr. Chamari, for your presentation and throughout the session, the support. It's really, thank you for all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.